Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul DeDuke. I'm the Director of Engineering Leadership and member of the Herbst faculty. Thanks so much for coming tonight. We're very excited to welcome Emmet Penney, the host of the podcast Exhaust. That's how I first came to discover Emmet. It's his first rise to prominence. Prominence is a good feeling, I'm guessing, Emmet. Yeah. He now is the founder and editor-in-chief of Grid Brief. He's also contributing editor to Compact Magazine, in addition to hosting Nuclear Barbarians. That's the new gig. All right, very good. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Emmet Penney. All right, is this mic'd or no? Yeah, okay, so everybody can hear me? All right, great. Give me one sec. Okay, well, let's hope this is gonna be fun. It was fun for me to work on this, and so I hope it's fun for you to hear it. I'm glad to see some friends in the audience and some, of course, mostly new faces. This will be exciting. So tonight, I'm gonna talk to you about the energy transition. I'm going to warn you now that it will also take me a while to get there. One reason for that is that I have to begin by discussing energy itself, which we struggle to comprehend, as even Richard Feynman pointed out. But we can try to understand what energy means to us by asking a simple question. Why was the Promethean gift fire? In Aeschylus's tragedy, Prometheus Bound, we find Prometheus sentenced to a miserable fate. Every day, an eagle, the symbol of Zeus, finds him bound to a rock and proceeds to eat his liver, the organ the Greeks thought to be the seat of all emotions. Every night, the god's liver would grow back. What warranted such grisly punishment? Prometheus's description of human life before fire gets us nearer the answer. For humans in the beginning had eyes, but saw to no purpose. They had ears, but did not hear. Like the shapes of dreams, they dragged through their long lives and muddled everything haphazardly. They did not know how to build brick houses to face the sun, nor how to work in wood. Absent will, absent power, and so absent artifice. We were supremely vulnerable to the world. It's important that Prometheus's account begins with our senses. It implies that human life is for something beyond sensorial input. We had the organs of sight and hearing, yet they grasped nothing, for there was no reason for them to grasp anything. That we were like the shapes of dreams bespeaks the poverty of life without purpose. Lastly, we knew not how to shelter ourselves. Notice that the description of humanity's condition moves outward, from the sensing organs to the mind to the expression of our will. Fire then was both symbol of and vehicle for our ability to create. Fire, combustion, energy gave us power. Power allowed us to work. And it's through work that human life flourishes. Perhaps Zeus punished Prometheus so brutally because his gift made us nearer to the gods. Before moving on, I'd like to dwell a bit more on our inherent vulnerability in the world, specifically in nature. Prometheus knows well that life without shelter leaves us victim to the elements. Nature is a harsh mistress. Few have expressed this as starkly as director Werner Herzog. In a clip from a documentary cataloging his insane quest to shoot the film Fitzcarraldo in the middle of a South American jungle, Herzog describes the natural world he sees around him as the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder. His plan, I wish I could do the accent for you guys, because that really sells it. As his plans to make the film Founder in the wild overgrowth, he comments that yes, he and the crew are in misery, but it is the same misery all around us. The trees are in misery, and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, he tells the camera, They just screech in pain. He says this not out of hate, but out of deep admiration for the jungle, which he says he loves against his better judgment. Nature is neither our friend nor our foe, but it is dangerous, and it is beautiful, and it is awful in its power. And we must make the world safe for ourselves if we mean to survive in it. Without energy, we're condemned to an outer dark, riven with depredations that hazard our fragile lives. We cannot flourish except with energy. So, we understand that energy allows us to work in such a way that we reduce the entropy into which we're born, allowing us to emerge from the pressures of mere survival. Refining our handling of energy took thousands of years. Alexander the Great discovered oil, but found it was useful only as a plaything. Ancient Macedonia lacked adequate refining capacity, it turns out. For millennia, human life was constrained by limited access to productive energy, respect for natural limits, and the search for the natural standards that course through the political, philosophical work of the ancients can be read as a response to the real concern of resource scarcity. What could be more injurious for a regime than the depletion of its stores? The urban polities that produced the intellectuals who struggled to puzzle out these problems had the most to worry about when it came to sustaining their energy supply. The size of traditional cities depended on two things: fuel wood and charcoal, each source constrained by low power density of phytomass production. Vaclav Smil writes, the power density of sustainable annual tree growth in temperate climates is at best equal to 2% of the power density of energy consumption for traditional urban heating, cooking, and manufactures. Consequently, cities had to draw on nearby areas at least 30 times their size for fuel supply. This reality restricted their growth even where other resources, such as food and water, were adequate. Such constraints are the story of most of human history. As the British agriculturalist Arthur Standish put it in 1611, and so it may be conceived, no wood, no kingdom. In this light, we can approach the natural standard that so occupied the ancients as an attempt to harmonize political life with the slim margins of energy that bound their world. Energy is wealth, and all wealth stems from human activity, and all human activity demands energy. There was just not much of it to go around. Not enough moisture in my mouth to go around. Okay, let's keep it rolling. But then a strange thing happened. From, say, 1750 onwards, a steady increase in income began. And after 1900, the increase accelerated rapidly. The period between the early and late 19th century, so the story goes, proved critical. As one researcher has pointed out, since 1820, the total product of the countries considered in a study of global GDP between 180 and 2003, pretty wide band, has increased 70-fold, population by 5-fold, per capita product 14-fold, and real per capita consumption by almost 10-fold. Annual working hours are down by half, and life expectancy has doubled. The term for this apparent discontinuity in energy abundance is the Industrial Revolution. And while European economies of all stripes in the time period under consideration expanded their industrial capabilities, no place was more pivotal than England, which had been in the process of replacing its wood-based economy with coal, thanks to the advent of Devonshire ironmonger Thomas Newcomen's steam engine in the early 1700s. From there, we began to incorporate fossil fuels into more and more of our activities. Coal was the key to unlocking this growth potential that seemed so impossible to our ancient forebears, that its impossibility felt to them as assured as the law of gravity to us. To put this growth in perspective, swapping coal for timber in Britain produced a quantity of energy many times the amount stored in the country's forests. By 1820, coal provided the equivalent of power as that of a woodland area, roughly the entire size of Britain's surface area. 20 years later, Coal's energy provision doubled, then doubled again in 1860, only to double once more by 1890. The diffusion of coal power radically reshaped society. City size was no longer limited by access to wood fuel, and thus urban areas grew denser. Class dynamics shifted as the insurgent bourgeois class rose to prominence on the back of the new energy-intensive industries. Their workforce flocked from farms to cities with grievances, desires, and demands of their own. Coal also brought us the most consequential of modern achievements, electricity. We take electricity for granted now, but when it first arrived, people could scarcely believe that it was real. A local Indiana newspaper reporting on the first ever arc light demonstration in its town square in the late 19th century writes that the light caused men to fall to their knees in astonishment. Before electricity, buildings could only stand so high. Who wants to walk up all those stairs? Elevators changed that. Children could now study at night, which increased the use of libraries. Cities no longer stank of horse manure and urine. Sewage systems removed the human contributions to the stench. Women could more safely walk home at night, and confined as they were to the domestic sphere in that era, housework took less of a toll on their bodies. No more scalding their hands on irons hot from the stove every day. But the best way to appreciate the boon of electricity is to read what life was like for American farmers before electrification. Harry Crews, who grew up on a farm in Bacon County, Georgia during the Great Depression, writes that for tenant farmers like his parents, survival was a day-to-day crisis as real as rickets in the bones of their children or the worms that would sometimes rise out of their children's stomachs and nest in their throats so that they had to be pulled out by hand to keep the children from choking. Their homes had little to no plumbing and no light save oil, lamps, or candles. In fact, the Rural Electrification Act, the most successful portion of the unprecedented New Deal, saved Harry Crews's life. As a child, he fell into a vat of scalding water meant to take the skin off of slaughtered hogs. It had the same effect on him. His doctor said a drying light needed to shine down on him at all times if he was to survive. The Rural Electrification Administration ran a line right to his home to provide it, sparing the young boy's life and giving America one of its most powerful voices in fiction. I gotta pick my beats, you know? The decades following the New Deal marked one of the largest upticks in wealth as measured by energy consumption in our nation's history. Robert Bryce writes, between 1940 and 1970, electricity production in the United States grew ninefold to more than 1,600 terawatt hours. Over that same 3-decade period, US gross national product increased nearly tenfold, going from 100 billion to 977 billion. Personal income soared, going from less than $600 per year to more than $3,900 per year in 1970 dollars. By 1970, the average American was consuming about 7,200 kilowatt hours of electricity per year, more than twice today's global average of about 3,100 kilowatt hours per capita per year. All told, between the late 1930s and the early 1970s, total American energy consumption increased by 300%. Historical progress, long a philosophical argument, appeared to many as an undeniable physical force when looking at statistics like these. And given Crews's haunting description of rural poverty, don't they have a point? Modernity has been a boon for the alleviation of poverty and suffering that a generation or two ago was both general and tragic. I should comment here, and in many places, it's still general and tragic. But I must say this account, using the harnessing of energy as a measurement for historical development and progress, is a bit reductionist. It's not that it fails in explanatory power, but that it omits what I see as the other half of the story. Changes in the guiding assumptions of Western thought. Modernity as a physical achievement co-emerged with successive waves of philosophical development. When did we begin to think like moderns? Who unleashed the first wave of modernity? The answer might be surprising for some, but the modern mode of thought flowered in the mind of an Italian philosopher whose life straddled the 15th and 16th centuries, Niccolò Machiavelli. I'm sure many in the room most associate his name with a slanderous term that we use to describe someone as both amoral and opportunistic, Machiavellian. This does a disservice to the breadth and depth of his thought, but it speaks to one of his major departures from the ancient thinkers. Machiavelli, Leo Strauss tells us, is in profound disagreement with the view of others regarding how a prince should conduct himself toward his subjects or friends. The reason for this disagreement is that he is concerned with the factual, practical truth, not with fancies. Many have imagined commonwealths and principalities which never were, because they looked at how men ought to live instead of how they do in fact live. Princes should govern people as they are, not how they should or could be. The other point of departure is Machiavelli's commitment, hold on for a second, which is that fortune is a woman, which means that we can control her by use of force. We likely would not put that so brutally today. I wouldn't, certainly. But 400 years later, after Machiavelli's birth, the British poet William Ernest Henley put it this way: "It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." What's vital to understand is that in classical political thought, the republics of fancy that Machiavelli ditched were meant to chart a course towards the best political regime, a regime capable of supplying its members with the opportunity to practice virtue. According to classical political philosophy, the establishment of the best regime depends necessarily on uncontrollable, elusive fortuna or chance, writes Strauss. Another way to understand the limiting role fortune played is to see nature as something that impressed itself upon humankind, not the other way around. Nature is independent of man's will, the ancients believed, a salutary truth. We belong to an order beyond us and with which we had to harmonize. Society was a natural part of this order. The good life, or the virtuous life, Strauss continues, is the life according to nature, which means to stay within certain limits. Virtue is essentially moderation. Not so for Machiavelli, nor for his two greatest pupils, Sir Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes replaced natural right's emergence from the pursuit of man's highest ends, of which participation in the polity is a constituent element, with what was previously thought to be the lowest concern, self-preservation. The political community was a compact born out of the wretched state of nature, the war of all against all, in Hobbes' eyes. Despite his monarchism, this maneuver would have a leveling and eventually democratic impact when filtered through John Locke and then the American founding fathers. Each of us is equal in threat to each other and so worthy of the same rights. From society as a means for alleviating mortal danger came the conception of society as a means for alleviating suffering through the diffusion of commerce and the expansion of rights. Bacon, meanwhile, mounted his own revolution in the natural sciences in Machiavelli's wake. No longer was man a receiver of knowledge, but a maker of knowledge. We give nature its laws, not the other way around. All meaning derives from man, the ultimate knowledge seeker freed from the shackles of final causes, who can proceed to dominate nature to improve his material condition. The power of this idea cannot be understated. It has not been without critics, of course, but neither has it been without beneficiaries, namely every single person sitting in this room. Ultimately, we see politics and political philosophy reduced to technical management and commercial expansion. Rousseau, the initiator of modernity's second wave, would decry this development as a loss of virtue. His forebears' major mistake was that their conception of man emerged dislocated from history. What previous philosophers took as the state of nature and thus the origin point of society was little more than a snapshot of men in their time. Man should not be seen as the naturally social creature of ancient thought, nor as the antisocial creature of Hobbes's reckoning, but as a historical creature in the process of developing over time. In Rousseau's view, humanity is malleable and perfectible, cultivating itself through the rationality of the general will. Rousseau's heirs, Kant, Hegel, and Karl Marx, would supply the ultimate ends of this historical development theory that we have all now come to call progress, which was understood as not merely material improvement, but moral and political improvement as well. There is indeed a third wave of modernity unleashed by Nietzsche. It is relevant to our times, but not to the present discussion. As Strauss rightly pointed out, in America, we live in a Republican liberal democracy. Many of our difficulties and our triumphs stem from these first two waves of modernity. Therefore, I will forego a discussion of the third wave and address something likely lurking in the back of the close listener's mind. Toward the beginning of the lecture, I said that the enormous rate increase of energy began in the middle of the 18th century, exploding a century later. But then I mentioned Newcomen's steam engine, which arrived in 1712. Yet his was not the first steam engine at all, just the best of the firsts. And then after that, I brought in Machiavelli as the father of our modern mindset, but he was born in the 1400s. I even went so far as to say that modernity is both an intellectual and physical achievement co-emerged with each other. It should be obvious that these timelines don't add up. So either I'm being sloppy, or I'm suggesting something about the inherited wisdom about what we call the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, it is the latter. There are at least two problems with the typical account of the Industrial Revolution. The first has to do with the so-called rate increase of energy. If we compare world gross domestic product from 1 AD to the beginning of this millennium, we'll see a hockey stick that begins its curve upward around the early 19th century. Similarly, as scholar John Constable suggests, if we graph 5% compound interest on a single US dollar, we see a similar pattern. I'm not arguing that no rate increase of energy occurred, but that the second graph of compound interest, as Constable points out, suggests that there doesn't have to be a revolution, a major discontinuity at the foot of the curve to explain it. If the rate increase isn't necessary to account for the ramp up in energy abundance, then perhaps what we call the Industrial Revolution did not span decades, but hundreds of years. Small refinements in agriculture, sale, and tools, etc., compounding until taking off exponentially. That would hardly qualify as a revolution. But surely those who lived through the 19th century knew what they were talking about, especially in England, the Promethean epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. No doubt, late 18th and early 19th century British philosophy, literature, and economics must appear festooned with the phrase Industrial Revolution. Who could live through a revolution and not know it? But surveying the literature, Constable writes, the field of modern economics was founded in the English language by Adam Smith, T.R. Malthus, and David Ricardo during exactly this period, 1750 to 1820. Not one of them uses the term Industrial Revolution or anything like it. Robert Owen, the idealist social thinker and factory owner, wrote extensively about the changes in the manufacturing system, but never used the term. Thomas Carlyle came close in Sartor Resartus, published in 1834, but written a few years prior, when he spoke of steam engines rapidly enough overturning the whole old system of society in favor of industrialism. Given Carlyle's knowledge of the French Revolution, that is surely significant. John Stuart Mill did use the term once in his Principles of Political Economy in 1848, but he wasn't referring to England and he didn't use capitals. Neither Dickens's Hard Times, 1854, nor Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, 1869, use the term. It doesn't even appear in mid-century standard textbooks like Fawcett's Manual of Political Economy, published in 1863. Perhaps most striking of all, W.S. Jevons, the engineers will know the Jevons paradox, One of the greatest mid-century economists wrote an entire book on the coal question, published in 1865, arguing vigorously that coal lay at the root of modern British wealth, and used the term industrial revolution only once, and though in reference to England, it was not capitalized. If the Brits didn't recognize what was happening as a revolution, then where did this phrase come from? Constable locates its first usage in France in the late 1820s. Though J.B. Say, professor of economics at the College of France, described the effects of cotton spinning in England as economically revolutionary, it was his student, Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui, in 1837, who expressed his surprise that moderate, unrevolutionary Britain was seeing quicksilver economic modernization. Blanqui wrote in his history of the political economy of Europe, while the French Revolution was making its great social experiments over a volcano, England was beginning hers on the solid ground of the industries. The conditions of labor underwent the greatest modification they have experienced since the origin of society. Two machines, henceforth immortal, the steam engine and the spinning machine, overturned the old commercial system and gave birth almost simultaneously to material products and social questions unknown to our fathers. However, hardly was the Industrial Revolution born from the brain of these two men of genius, Watt and Arkwright, when it took possession of England. Frederick Engels then borrowed it from Blanqui, and its closest friend, Karl Marx, took it from him. Blanqui is French, Marx and Engels German. The phrase wouldn't appear in English again until the late 1880s, when two American translators brought Blanqui's work to the attention of Arnold Toynbee, a tutor in political economy at Balliol College in Oxford. Toynbee died 3 years later, but soon after that, his influential lectures on the English Industrial Revolution were published. 4 years after that, in 1887, the phrase made its first appearance in the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is all to say that what we commonly call the Industrial Revolution is not a hard fact, but a historical interpretation vulnerable to the same doubts and interrogations as any other interpretation. We have been modern for longer than we typically think, and perhaps less modern than we believe. It may very well be the case that while we have materially improved our situation, we have not historically progressed in the way that some Enlightenment thinkers have imagined. For now, hold on to your doubts about the mythology of the Industrial Revolution. We cannot deny that our energy consumption has increased and that now this is putting stress on the planet. While climate change will not end the world, and despite the fact that planetary warming measurements do not approximate global quality of life, it is still a serious challenge for us to confront. The main policy idea for solving climate change is what's called the energy transition. This involves electrifying more human activity while replacing thermal generation, coal, nuclear, gas, with renewable electricity from wind and solar. There are two major problems with this plan. The first is technical. No modern industrial society has run its electricity sector off of intermittent resources, and for good reason. The electricity grid must be reconciled every single microsecond. It cannot remain at 60 hertz. If it cannot remain at 60 hertz at all times, blackouts occur. It's a system that prizes reliability and dispatchability, meaning you can make the power go where you want it, when you want it, above all else. Solar's major weakness is well known. It stops working when the sun sets. No one was more aware of this than Californians, who saw natural gas turbines fire up to supply 60% of demand when solar dropped off the grid during last August's heat wave. The other problem is that the more solar gets added to the grid, the less valuable and less profitable it becomes. The hope is that batteries can offset solar's cannibalization, but batteries are and will for the foreseeable future remain too expensive to even attempt to supply this at the seasonal scale needed. Moreover, storage is not synonymous with generation. And not everywhere is California, a generally sunny and temperate locale. Similarly, Not everywhere is the windy Midwest. States like Iowa, where wind tends to perform quite well. It has a better capacity factor than solar, but it is less predictable in output. Continuing to phase out thermal generation and replacing it with non-dispatchable intermittent resources while increasing demand for electricity is a losing proposition. It is already wreaking havoc on the grid, despite the fact that extreme weather brought on by climate change is touted as the major threat to America's electricity system. We've got another block quote coming up, so get ready because I'm about to get ready. In a recent letter, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's James Danley wrote the following: "Weather is not the primary problem we face with keeping the lights on. The main problem is the quantity of generation available to meet load. An insufficiency makes the grid fragile during severe weather. This insufficiency is occurring because of the retirement of dispatchable resources and their replacement with intermittence." In its 2021 long-term reliability assessment, the North American Electric Reliability Corp stated that energy risks emerge when variable resources like wind and solar are not supported by flexible resources that include sufficient dispatchable, fuel-assured, and weatherized generation. NERC provides several examples. Mid-continent independent system operator, for those of you that don't spend all day looking at FERC maps like I do, that stretches from Louisiana to the top of Minnesota, right? So it's a big portion of the country. Could face the retirement and resultant loss of over 13 gigawatts of resource capacity over the 2021 to 2024 period. So that means lots of power plants, gobs of them. At this level of retirements, resource additions must increase beyond current projections to avoid capacity shortfall. In 2024, capacity shortfall is an industry term meaning you don't have enough, so you're hoping someone else does and that you can buy it from them. In the California independent system operator, energy risks are present today as electricity resources are insufficient to manage the risk of load loss when wide area heat events occur. That's technical for heat wave. I don't know why it needs to be phrased like that, but there it is. And the US Northwest and Southwest parts of the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, I think Colorado's in there, a few other states, have increasingly variable resource profiles, raising the risk of energy shortfalls. I should add that the regional transmission organizations, which are the markets that preside over the buying and selling of electricity in these areas, agree with Commissioner Danley's assessment. Danley continues, federal and state policies by mandate or subsidy have spurred the development of weather-dependent generation resources, which are driving dispatchable resources into insolvency. The thinner and thinner reserve margins resulting from these incentives render the electric system ever more susceptible to instability in the face of any contingency, weather being but one possibility. But wait, there's more. PJM, a grid operator that covers 13 eastern and midwestern states, including part of where I live, northern Illinois, serves up to 65 million people, reported this week that the energy transition is coming on more quickly than it can bear. PJM believes that up to 40 gigawatts of existing generation, enough to power 30 million households, are at risk of retirement by the end of the decade. That's over 1/5 of its current installed capacity. 94% of the resources in its interconnection queue are renewable. Historically, the rate of completion for these projects is a slim 5%. For the first time in recent history, PJM faces potentially decreasing reserve margins as a result of these policies. This is bad news for MISO, that tall one that I talked to you about a little bit ago, which is facing nearly identical problems and relies on PJM's more robust margins for imports when its renewables fleet fails, as it did last week when wind stopped blowing in much of the Midwest. In other words, the energy transition is undermining the performance of the grid, making it less reliable. Even worse, it's undermining the climate goals that it's meant to reach. For example, California's 2021 diesel backup aggregation grew to 24 times the size of its entire battery fleet. That's equal to 15% of the state's formal generating capacity. New England has made it through successive winters only by reverting to dirty oil fire generation, sometimes serving as much as 20% of the region's electricity demand. PJM switched back to burning oil during the Christmas freeze last year as well. And Generac, the largest personal generator company in America, can hardly keep up with demand for its product. Who's buying Generacs? People who live in states with high renewables penetration. The second problem with the energy transition is that it relies on the mythology of the Industrial Revolution. The thinking goes that if we could gallop past the wood economy with fossil fuels, then we could ditch fossil fuels for renewables in the same amount of time. I won't recapitulate the readjusted timescale I've already explored for the Industrial Revolution. I will only point out that people have been pushing for an all-renewable future since the 1970s. As it stands today, renewable energy, excluding hydropower, comprised about 6% of the world's primary energy consumption in 2021, according to Our World in Data. The technical limitations aside, do we really believe that anyone will fully decarbonize by the end of the decade, as so many policies demand, especially given the manner these objectives are being pursued? Earlier, I spoke of the ancients' view of natural limitations as a good and beautiful thing. I swear, I'm bringing it all back, don't worry. I know I went out there, I'm coming back in, don't worry. We have clearly surpassed what they thought was possible when it comes to energy production and consumption. But doesn't the physical world, our built world, have limitations of its own? We are testing those limits and flirting with disaster as we speak. Perhaps, as Strauss suggests, and as my troubling of the Industrial Revolution narrative implies, we are not quite as modern as we imagine ourselves to be. We have not totally broken with what came before us, and that we might have something to learn from the ancients about the pursuit of the virtuous life in an industrialized society. I've mentioned the technical problems with the energy transition and the disturbing trends we've already begun to see. Blackouts are dangerous. There is no strong, wealthy country with a weak electrical grid. But these are problems of survival, and life is meant for more than that. The fragilization of the grid, however, does not simply pose problems for self-preservation, but for our social trust. As a young House representative, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech on the dangers of mob violence and vigilante justice. He said that such actions, even if in some cases justified, injured people's faith in the law and rent the social fabric. By such things, said Lincoln, the feelings of the best citizens will become more or less alienated from government, and thus it will be left without friends or with too few, and those few too weak to make their friendship effectual. At such a time and under such circumstances, men of sufficient talent and ambition will not be wanting to seize the opportunity, strike the blow, and overturn that fair fabric, which for the last half century has been the fondest hope of the lovers of freedom throughout the world. As it goes for our legal commons, so it goes for our industrial commons. A fragile grid will demoralize the polis in much the same way. And if we find ourselves lacking in trust, we will find ourselves lacking in friendship even more. It was Aristotle's contention that without friendship, no society could survive. No friendship, no kingdom. I believe him just as I believe Lincoln. The material consequences of a fragile grid are but a small evil compared to the social consequences. If the ancients saw moderation as the essential virtue, what does that mean for us when it comes to climate change? I have but a humble suggestion. We walk the path of industrial conservation. Rather than trying to radically reshape industrial society, we should see it as a commons we have inherited that ought to be stewarded for both our use and that of posterity. Some might be wondering if I mean that we should not try to decarbonize our electricity sector or electrify more of our activities. Far from it. I ask only that we pursue the proven path of displacing fossil fuels. The French nuclear build-out in the 1970s and Ontario's more recent coal to nuclear transition. The latter is of great importance for us. Ontario succeeded in retraining its coal workers to run its nuclear fleet, thus maintaining those high-paying, socially meaningful jobs that allowed these communities to flourish. For us to do this would not be an easy task, but it would be an excellent one. And the pursuit of excellence is what life is for. Thank you. Questions that were sent in advance, but I'll give the audience first.
Thank you. First of all, I'm wondering about this sort of closing idea you have about moderation, which is rooted in a concern for the social fabric.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the fact that there's already concerns about the social fabric make it more difficult to actually pursue that policy?
Yes.
Is this a partisan issue to some extent?
I want it not to be. I think a few things, right? I think that we are starting to see glimmers of more bipartisan concern over this because people often blame politicians when blackouts are happening, even if it's not the politician's fault, and they tend to want to get reelected, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And so there are already some people working to collaborate on this. I think we've seen the beginnings of helpful collaboration on nuclear bipartisan, but the culture wars we deal with are a very strange whipsaw, and it is hard to predict. I make this case fervently, but not with great optimism for its easiness. And I think what you've identified will be one of many headwinds.
So how much is American federalism a source of the fragility that we have? I mean, we have a disintegrated set of grids, and then we have a disintegrated set of policies. And I can't imagine that the American government facilitating, the American federal government facilitating energy transition, like the mini one you described in Ontario, would mean Canadians are just more real.
Well, I'd say that's definitely true. And that's yeah, except for this guy. No, I think that's a very fair question. Here's what I mean to demonstrate with that. First of all, we would never do something quite the way that Ontario did it, just like we would never do something quite the way France did it, but we still have the largest, most successful nuclear fleet in the world, despite not having done it that way, right? So there are probably all sorts of policy ways. I mean, this gets into deep territory about the structures of the grid, the overlapping sets of responsibilities between regulators, public utility commissions, private utilities, public utilities. There are some 3,000 organizations that make up the American grid, and that's not counting all of the mediating bodies that deal with those organizations. So yeah, again, that's a big challenge. I think this is why we're seeing the TVA, of all places, willing to go big on nuclear, especially to phase out its coal. And that's because it has the authority to do that and the ability to do that. Do I think that that should be relegated only to legacy New Deal public entities that will not come back around again? No, but I think we can still create private conditions for a similar goal. One might be, and this is just one example, is we could have a policy of pre-slating coal plants that are scheduled to retire for replacement, pre-license the grounds for nuclear. That would be a pretty easy fix. If the community wants that, they can pitch into it. We can maintain our federalist virtues. Maybe they don't, that's fine. But I don't know if anybody here is from a place where a coal or nuclear plant has shut down prematurely. It's difficult for me, without getting emotional, to communicate the level of tragedy those communities experience. And so when I'm speaking of this sense of moderation, it is not just for these material aspects, but it's for places that will be resistant to the ravages of the drug economy and the poverty that creeps in when those things disappear. We're watching it happen in Buchanan, New York right now, where Indian Point was prematurely closed down. That was a nuclear plant. It was replaced by natural gas. That community lost half of its tax base overnight. No one comes back from that. Next question.
You mentioned before that places that were going to have trouble with energy because they've had this transition to renewables would maybe turn to other places that have extra energy and try to buy them.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's a solution there, just branching off of the federalism question,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, could there be places that do have the capacity to build these things? Like there's a political will to do it, to ramp up nuclear and become sort of like a stabilizing force in selling it.
Totally. Sure. So I can talk big on my home state, Illinois, where we've put a lot of work into saving our plants. We're the most nuclear state in the country, and therefore one of the cleanest when it comes to electricity production. And I can tell you right now, I actually just interviewed somebody for my podcast, this older gentleman who's a friend of mine, Alan, who has been taking his time off to take the train down to Springfield and talk to state legislators one by one about repealing the nuclear moratorium so that we can get towards that. And there is bipartisan buy-in there. And that's because the people who have those plants love them. And they want to keep them and they want to see more of them. And because Illinois is a very interesting state in terms of which parts are red and which parts are blue, and the workforces for those plants tend to live and bipartisanly, like at the county level, it's starting to create a culture of consensus where there wasn't one before. So I think that is a very positive sign. And I should mention that part of Illinois is the only part of Illinois in PJM. So it would be theoretically able to export to MISO when it runs into trouble.
Thanks for the talk. I want to say for any students that think all two rows, oddly enough, but this is what a firm ground in liberal arts and history philosophy allows you to do to people rural regional clubs. You also find common bits. Great job of that. One thing I think you left the third wave from the talk. I think that's really actually important. One way to read the history of political philosophy after Bacon is that it's always trying to sort of jerry-rig a political system after the fact to sort of scientific innovation.
Mm-hmm.
As Bacon's project goes from like an insular secretive thing to a more popular part, suddenly you're getting, capitalism merging with capitalism. You get this sort of hybrid. I think as you think about historical progress, and as people started under the pressures of this sort of public acknowledgement that it seems like everything's just matter, it's all materialism. The only sort of way to understand human life or our collective arrangements is as these grand historical projects, and then get something like Nietzsche. I think the challenge is actually quite deep, and I think when you look at people like Nietzsche and later Heidegger and Strauss responding to that, rescuing a more moderate understanding of nature has to contend with this behemoth, which is that, oh, you think things are more than matter? Well, look at this. I can go to Mars and all this stuff because I assume that's all it is.
Right.
I assume it's infinitely malleable, and therefore the concrete limiting forms that I see around me are not actually fundamental, right? Actually, and so you get genetic theory, you get all sorts of post-humanism, transhumanism, all that sort of stuff. And I do think confronting that third wave would do a lot. Maybe you have more to say.
So So first of all, Alex, when I wrote that part, I was like, Priyu's going to ask me about this in the Q&A, and he has every right to. And it was only because there were several versions of this, because this basically kept me up at night for like 2 weeks writing this thing. I was joking with Paul that, Oscar Wilde says there are two tragedies in life: not getting what you want and getting it. And I've been wanting to write this thing for a while, and then eventually it happened for me, and luckily that I get to share it with you. And really, it was that the richness and complexity of encountering Nietzsche and the sort of third wave modernity problems became, first of all, it just made the thing too damn long. That was really it. And the other part of it was I needed to hit the stacks in a way that I couldn't leading up to this. I really wanted to sit down with Heidegger's question concerning technology and some more Strauss to try to think through this and try to get like a more capacious understanding, which I think would have spoken to, in a way, your question about what to do with the cultural fracas around this. And I didn't get an opportunity to do that. So I think that that's a shortcoming here, and you're right to address it.
Other questions? No. I have a question of my own, a couple of actually, but so in your talk, you pointed to our false conception of the Industrial Revolution as a major contributing factor to potentially dangerous opinions about the feasibility of energy transition.
Yeah.
Are there other contributing factors apart from our misapprehension of the Industrial Revolution that also make us overly optimistic about energy transition?
Yeah. So I feel like Paul's trying to get me in trouble here somehow. I don't know what gives me that impression. Yeah, so I think I think it's not monocausal. I mean, this isn't even monocausal. This is but one element of, I think, our misapprehension of what's possible that I think is under addressed, which is why I brought it here.
Yeah.
I think that I had a whole segment of this on the Christopher Lasch's culture of narcissism and how it fits well with the culture of fear, about sort of a permanent fragility of the self and the world and the inability to distinguish between those two things, and how this sort of stubborn nihilism sets in that isn't active but passive. And I think it gets almost reified by our consumer society, especially in a world where we all get to be prosumers of media content, right? We can brand ourselves. It's sort of the Jay-Z line, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman, you know? And so I think that's part of it here too. And that is one of the problems that I think I struggle with every day. I think Mark Fisher, who is a Marxist social critic, had a really great line that spoke to some of the issues we have in trying to have deep or almost tactile things in our world. And he said that, riffing off of Marx, he said, all that is solid melts into PR. And I think that's a pretty good slogan for a lot of where we're at and why things feel both stubborn and mystifying at the same time. I mean, I hope I'm not alone in waking up and going through my day and feeling like there were almost nagging metaphysical or existential doubts about what actually is or could be, and an inability to understand where to go to reconcile those. There seems to be no longer any clearinghouse of tradition even. That's not even to say that tradition is all one thing over time. Tradition is usually one big shouting match where you sort of reshuffle who the loudest voices are at a given moment, you know, but it is a context for making meaning. And it feels harder and harder to figure out what that context is. And I think that that has a multivalent impact on our ability to reckon even brass tacks issues that are very technical like this.
So it feels like your recommendation is build more people.
Yeah.
How do you do that in a place or a state that may not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's something that I've started to ask some of the people I know who do a lot of more, like Alan, for example. Turned out all that you needed to do was be a really nice, older, non-threatening Episcopalian guy who brings atomic fireballs with him to the Capitol building and hands them out and says, do you have 5 minutes to talk about nuclear? This guy's like the one-man army of taking the Amtrak out to Springfield and doing this. And that seemed to be enough there because it wasn't clear, especially when there was a big fight over keeping 2 of the nuclear plants in the state, Byron and Dresden, open, just a couple years ago, whether or not there was consensus. So for states that have, let's pick a really great example, California, which has an avowedly anti-nuclear stance. It remains difficult for a lot of the advocates I know out there to even get a word in. What I've noticed works is it's really helpful if you have a super attractive Brazilian supermodel named Isabel Bemeke, who can do comms work for you about how important nuclear is for climate change, specifically keeping the Diablo Canyon plant open. And then I actually think that the most humble beginning begins with talking to coworkers and neighbors and people that you know. The only way that convincing people of things works like this, like eventually you'll have political fights where there will be people who are just in the opposite faction and there's nothing you can do about that. You'll just have to duke it out. And that's the way it goes. But the people that can be convinced will be the people that already trust you. And that's where it begins. And that's all that I've found to be successful in my life so far, talking about this, is that friends I know who know that I used to not believe in nuclear and want to know why I changed my mind and how, and fielding their questions and talking about it with them at length has been the way to do it. I've certainly spilt my fair share of ink writing incendiary things about opponents of nuclear, and that might be of dubious help in the long term, but I couldn't help myself. But I would say perhaps the softer, gentler path is the good initial start. And maybe even just going to the state capitol and saying, do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 5 minutes?
Good questions. How about a question or two from online, from the ether?
Let's do it.
How has rooftop solar and net metering affected the retail price of electricity purchased from the utility company?
Oh my God. Wow. Damn. I knew it. I knew there was going to be like one question. I was going to be like, there's going to be something I haven't thought about in like a year and a half. And somebody's going to bring it up. So I think that's going to vary state to state. As far as how net metering works, I mean, I'm not a regulatory expert on this. I know that the California utilities don't like the net metering scheme there. That's basically when people who have rooftop solar are paid for the power that they provide to the grid. This ends up over time sort of creating an upward transfer of wealth, because it means that people who aren't homeowners and can't do that end up subsidizing people who, I mean, if you own a house in America, if you own a house in California, I mean, come on, like, you know, and people are rightfully mad about that. If you bring that up at the Public Utility Commission, though, man, do they think that you're an evil person for criticizing their rooftop solar panels. So as far as for like the price metrics and things like that, I'm going to have to disappoint this question answer. I can only talk in vague terms about it. It's been a while since I've looked at the issue. I know if people want to go check into it, a couple of years ago, the Grist put out a really great deep dive into net metering in California and the debate over it. I thought it was very fair. I thought it was very honest. And I know that it was fair and honest because they caught a lot of hell from it, despite the fact that it was quite a mild piece. So whoever wrote that, go check it out. And thank that journalist, because I think they did a great job.
I have a question about, you don't have to answer this, maybe we can talk about this later, but
I'm not answering.
I'm interested in what you think might have contributed, like was there an influence of Baconian science on the, let's say, uptake of, I don't know, technical or like industrial capacity in the 18th century? Or is physical modernity really a separate stream from?
No. They move together. They move together. I mean, these things, I think we also have to realize that like what science is has changed a lot over time. especially in these early days, excuse me, there were, first of all, it just wasn't institutionalized in the way it is now. It's been refined a lot. We've certainly learned a lot, and also learned how much we don't know about a lot of things over the years. But the scientific method, and I would also think these sort of standardizations that end up rolling out over time, sort of in a feedback loop with refinements in the scientific method, like this is really niche, but it's really hard to undersell how important the standardization of screw size was in America in the late 19th century. Like that had a huge impact on sort of portability across industries, right? So things like this. And I think you really only get that through sort of Bacon and then going through Newton, et cetera, et cetera. And I should say that the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century were indeed students of the liberal arts. Like they did not see what they were doing as a separate domain. They took inspiration from things like Plato's Timaeus and stuff like that. They understood who their historical forebears were at a deep intellectual level. I think there's some, beautiful Niels Bohr quotes that I wish I could remember about his interest in the ancients. So yeah, Oppenheimer as well. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these people were. So I think it's important to say when I meant co-emergent, I also meant that these things were happening, they were migrating across each other, right? I think that that's what's both fascinating and powerful about it, right? I think it frustrates the tendency towards strictly intellectual and strictly materialist history. You know, we have to almost look at this process of refinement and reflection and doubt becoming a big part of it, right? So, yeah.
I know that you've written a bit about Christopher Lasch and his ideas around like degrowth and
Sure, yeah. Oh, somebody's read my compact article.
right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
as a fan of Christopher Lasch, but who was saying, you know, like degrowth is not the way. Could you say a little bit about like teasing apart? Like, we keep coming back to moderation as like an important part of
Yeah,
this,
sure.
and how moderation. I think a lot of people would think that degrowth and moderation would have a lot in common, but it sounds like you see them as being separate. And
Sure.
that one's good, one is bad.
Yeah, so first of all, I've had a devil of a time trying to pin down really what people mean by degrowth. I've gotten enough arguments where there seems to be like this no true Scotsman machine around it. So I haven't gotten anybody to give me like a straight answer about what they mean. What I generally understand them to mean is they want to reduce the industrial intensity of society overall to spare the planet. I think that this is a sort of a mistaken notion, because people will greet that with incredible hostility. And it's not just that they won't like it, it's that it might have effects opposite to what they would actually want, like lowering the carbon footprint of humanity. I'll put it this way. My friend Paris Ortiz Wines was in Europe for a pro-nuclear event. And she was talking to somebody who's like a hardcore climate hawk, right? And that's why they really love nuclear. And so they're all in on it. That's like their main concern. But this person said something, she called me and told me about it afterwards, and it just sort of left me speechless. The person said, I would burn the last tree on this earth to keep my daughter warm at night. And I think that it is that desire, that need in humanity that degrowth misunderstands, even though in Lasch's case, what he is worried about is sort of industrialism run riot, which, by the way, was a foremost concern, especially stretching from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the revelations of what happens in both Nazi and Stalinist camps. This had a deleterious effect on the champions of progress because it said something about the human subject that they couldn't quite confront in their own assumptions about the historical flow of time. So barbaric were these events. And then there was the 1970s oil shock, which totally changed America's relationship with the idea of growth overall. So why I'm arguing for a different type of moderation is that I feel like there is a lack of literacy, and this isn't me trying to like dunk on anybody. I'm talking about myself here too. Like I'm a humanities guy. Do you know how annoying it is to read this FERC regulation stuff? It's my job, and I don't like that part of my job. But there's a lack of literacy about the built world. And I think often there is a knee-jerk, anti-intellectual, but still philosophical response to what exactly it's given us. And so my attempt at moderation is to try to bring in what I think are larger order concerns about the planet and about the human community, or reduce it to even the community of the nation state, or whatever. And these larger sort of alienating industrial systems. And so I think it's in part pedagogical from my perspective, but there's also almost something, I don't even know how I mean this, because I don't feel it in this almost secular way, but there is almost something of this spiritual understanding of being in the flow of time with those who've come before us. You know, I think there are very simple things that I do now, having become a little bit more fluent in this material world, where I've become more humble about what I do and don't know. And just overwhelming gratitude that there are nameless people who came up with the thing where I go like this and then the urinal flushes. Amazing. You know, somebody did that. That was somebody's life, and not just their life, you know. Somebody split the atom, you know. The original Chicago Pile 1, which was where that first reaction took place, by the way, is like parts of it are housed in the back of some obscure theater in Chicago. No one can quite remember where it is, and no one has the money to rescue it. I have an uncle who was a curator for the Museum of Science and Industry that finally tracked it down, and they couldn't rescue it. And I think that when we lose those parts of the past, we lose a sense of ourself and the world as well. This is sort of getting far afield from what you're saying, but what I'm really trying to intimate is that, like, I only think the degrowth project can be pursued through incredibly antisocial austerity measures that will counteract the goals of human harmony that I see so many degrowth advocates pine for. And that's a shame. And I get where it comes from, because it comes out of a sense of fear. And fear and anger seem to be now two of our most primary and intense emotions culture-wide. So, yeah, Alex is dying to get in here. What's up?
Yeah. So maybe to concentrate this question a little bit, but so it seems to me, I'm convinced that nuclear will solve a lot.
Yeah.
I say that somebody's never looked at Berkeley now, because I just heard that this is.
Yeah.
So, but the problem is all these people working on this problem, sort of based on that, it's just to go away immediately. The moderation lesson, I think, is a good one, but it seems like you also need a positive goal, progress for all these people, these entrepreneurs. So if someone were to press you, what would be this new project that people could work on that would substantially improve our lives? What would it be? Because when you kind of look around, there's a lot of like goofy projects. Like I just read an article, I think today, Mark Zuckerberg just hands out. Like so like that's a dead end.
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
So what do you think would be a better use if we were to get the nuclear issue? And obviously that's got its own political.
Sure.
What would be a better sort of focus of scientific progress and technology?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've been really trying to puzzle this out. Like part of the reason why I wanted to write this is because I had sort of, Paul introduced me by bringing up my now defunct podcast Exhaust, which the whole theme of which was why nothing felt possible. And one of the things that my co-host John and I wanted to do was to try and understand. We were like, okay, a lot of things that we've thought we're wrong about, so let's reconsider a lot of what we're looking at. And that brought the first question to me of, if we're less modern, perhaps, than we think we are, and perhaps progress isn't quite what we've been told that it is, and we might have more in common with the ancients than we thought, then what will that mean at a civic scale? What does that mean for us? What does that mean in a pluralistic society as America is, where there are all sorts of contending views of what the future should be, even within the capital P sort of Whiggish progress camp? And I have to admit, I'm still sort of puzzling this one through, and I don't totally understand it. But one of the things that I've thought about, maybe this phrase will help. A few years ago, I wrote a piece for the American Conservative called Industrial Cathedrals, which was about nuclear plants and what I thought they could bring. And that I thought that they provided a very cathedral-like element to life, and that they were intensive projects that required a lot of people to work on them, perhaps even mothers and daughters over time, fathers and sons, in the same way that Notre Dame was built, obviously not in like hundreds of years time period, but that they had this sort of anchoring effect that allowed for the, let's say, sufficiencies beyond mere survival to be provided for. And one of the things that I noticed while looking at communities that had nuclear was that there were all sorts of civic institutions that people at the plant put together with the local schools, with local clubs and stuff like that. There seemed to be this localist culture around something that most people see as big, vertical, and imposing. And that surprised me. And I'm really only gesturing towards that because I don't think it's like this technical fix where we just like build it and then it all works out. But there is something about considering the community as a place where those expressions of civic virtue can exist, and that people can engage in projects that allow for their fellow citizens to engage in that, is perhaps a related but different story than the one of progress that is much more specific to the everyday lives of people. Now, whether that's big enough to sustain a national ideology, let alone a global one, I have big questions about. But I think something in that direction speaks powerfully to me, even if it's not fleshed out. So I'm sorry I can't.
Questions?
Do we have more highly specific electricity questions?
Yeah, you want to do one more and then we'll wrap it up?
Sure.
How will price differences
Oh my
between green energy and conventional energy affect American industries and cost of living? If you don't want to answer that.
No, okay, so that's a fair question. Yeah, there's a very complicated tapestry of industrial interactions that happen here when it comes to the price of power and its impact on the price of goods or things like that. It's not always the case that if you have an expensive input, it means that the downstream product is going to be like unbearably expensive or whatever. I think the economic historian has left the room, so I can feel more comfortable in saying that out loud on record and on mic, even if I'm not 100% sure about it. But I think we can take a look at sort of what happens to aluminum smelting facilities in Germany and in Europe generally right now. I was actually talking to somebody from the Balkans about this the other day. And basically the cost of energy has made it so they've had to shut down all of these plants. They just can't afford the power to do it. And part of the reason that happens is because, let's say you run your grid on a lot of natural gas, right? Okay, so that means that if the price of natural gas goes up, that's going to increase the price of electricity. If you have something that's really, that needs tons and tons of megawatts, like aluminum smelting does, you can't afford to keep operating. It doesn't work that way. And we can see similar problems in Japan for how some of this is playing out. I mean, right now they're so hungry for power and grid reliability and have so sort of messed up their own energy policy that they're building a new coal plant in the middle of Tokyo. If you could sort of believe that, that's sort of like an amazing thing to have happen. But one thing that everybody in Japan has noticed, and this is why they're restarting a lot of their nuclear plants, is that every principality that has a nuclear plant is paying like 40% less on their bills than like every other place. And that's because they're highly reliant on imports and things like that. So I'm probably I'm not answering this to this person's satisfaction, like I can feel it in my bones. But I hope that that's sort of enough to sort of paint a picture of how interrelated these things are, and how important and how difficult it is to get right. Because the other thing is, if you run a utility or something like that and you mess up, everyone hates you. And if you do a really good job, no one knows you're there. A lot of this stuff has just become, I mean, like these are amazing, these lights. So yeah, anyway, I hope that I don't even know, but if they're mad, they can email me, I guess.
All right, guys, let's take a minute.